Rorschach's Journal, October 12th, 1985. Dog carcass in alley this morning. Tired tread on burst stomach. This city is afraid of me. I have seen its true face. The streets are extended gutters, and the gutters are full of blood, and when the drains finally scab over, all the vermin will drown. The accumulated filth of all their sex and murder will foam up about their waists, and all the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us!" And I'll look down and whisper, "No." They had a choice, all of them. They could have followed in the footsteps of good men like my father or President Truman, decent men who believed in a day's work for a day's pay. Instead, they followed the droppings of lechers and communists and didn't realize that the trail led over a precipice until it was too late. Don't tell me they didn't have a choice. Now the whole world stands on the brink, staring down into bloody hell. All those liberals and intellectuals and smooth talkers, and all of a sudden nobody can think of anything to say. That's quite a drop. This is a poem of perspective. In the first panel, we find ourselves staring at a brick and a smiley face button drenched in blood and wallowing in a narrative about a dog carcass. In the text box, the diarist Rorschach claims to have a greater perspective on these things, to have seen the city's true face. We only see the smiley button. In the second panel, we back away a bit, and thus have greater perspective. We can now see that we are looking at a street scene. Rorschach's narration backs away a bit as well, figuring the streets and the gutters as metaphorically awash in blood, though they literally are as well. 2 feet intrude from beneath the caption box, and we can only imagine the stickiness of the blood on the soles of the shoes. The last panel of the first tier broadens the scene further, giving us a larger example of the discord Rorschach writes about. The end is nigh man walks through a pool of blood, seemingly oblivious to everything except his mission, and the deli worker, tasked to hose down the sidewalk, yells at him. The tier resolved in Rorschach's statement, "I'll look down and whisper, no." Perspective provides explanation, perhaps, but not mercy. Indeed, the situation may be beyond all mercy. The second tier continues to move progressively away from the smiley face button, which is, initially at least, still just visible. Rorschach's narration also becomes broader, first focusing on authority figures who have impressed him by holding to a narrow philosophy of a day's work for a day's pay. President Truman and his dad. And then moving on to lechers and communists, and finally to whole swaths of the political spectrum, liberals and intellectuals. Yet the page also undercuts Rorschach's black and white worldview by introducing color and busy detail. What is that pyramid logo on the truck? Whose hand is visible in the last panel? The final panel opens up the perspective entirely, giving us room to examine the city scene from above. The width and breadth of the panel slows our reading down and asks us to add things up. The shattered glass, the now tiny stain of blood on the sidewalk, the man's remark tells us someone has fallen. But we also notice that from this perspective we can't see everything. Not the telling smiley face pin, not the little street corner scolding, not the track of blood-sticky shoe prints, and barely the logo on the truck. In fact, we are actually above the man at the window and can see his balding pate. Although he too can see the whole world, he doesn't look so mysterious or smart from our perspective now, and his comment, "That's quite a drop," confirmed that he's missed the wealth of clues to the mystery below. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons use the first page of Watchmen to create a poem of perspective. It asks, what do we gain from certain perspectives and what do we lose from others? And it suggests that the question is really a moral question of who watches over us, or who watches the law, or above the law even, who watches God? Who watches the watchman? The question is also a particular question of paranoia, one belonging to the 1980s and summed up nicely in Rorschach's remark, "Now the whole world stands on the brink." The same feeling occupied The Dark Knight Returns. Finally, it is a question of reading and writing. It is a question that asks, what does it mean to look at the comics page? Thus, the page can give us some perspective on comics themselves as a way into the process that makes it up. Watchmen appeared in 12 issues across 1986, finishing up finally in 1987. Thus, it is the last of the 3 texts I refer to as the 1986 trifecta. Here is the first page of Alan Moore's script as it is presented in the Absolute Watchmen edition. Moore is a major comics writer. Born in 1953 in Northampton, England, he has written a number of significant comic books, including V for Vendetta with David Lloyd, written from 1982 to 1989, From Hell with Eddie Campbell, written from 1989 to 1996, and perhaps the truly scariest comic I've ever read, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen with Kevin O'Neill, which started in 1999 and continues now, Promethea with J.H. Williams III from 1999 to 2005, and Lost Girls with Melinda Gebbie, which finished in 2006. Moore started out writing British fanzines in the 1970s and moved on to the series 2000 AD. He has written definitive Batman, Superman, and Swamp Thing stories and has received almost every award in the industry, with Watchmen the only graphic novel to make it onto Time magazine's all-time 100 novels list. Many of his comics have been made into movies, either with his misgivings, such as From Hell in 2001 and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in 2003, or with his outright objections, such as V for Vendetta in 2005 and Watchmen in 2009. Moore's script for the first page of Watchmen is 4 pages long. The first panel takes an entire single-spaced page. It begins, "All right, I'm psyched up. I've got blood up to my elbows, veins in my teeth, and my helmet and knee pads securely fastened. Let's get out there and make trouble." This first page is a series of vertical jumps that takes us up in a straight progression from a minute and microscopic detailed view of the gutters of New York up to a panoramic shot looking down upon the rooftops of this familiar and yet curiously altered cityscape. In the first panel, we are looking straight down at a drain opening in a perfectly ordinary gutter. To the right of the picture, the actual outer wall of the curb drops down away from us like a miniature cliff. Over more, towards the left, down at the bottom of the picture, we can see the old and worn metal of the drain cover, with solid darkness visible between its slats. Up at the top of the picture, we can just see the dirty gutter running down toward the mouth of the drain. Moore's script talks to the illustrator, Dave Gibbons, with the enthusiasm of the superhero genre. It directs the action, explaining the progressive movement away from the microscopic view of the gutter, in which the curb looks like a miniature cliff, all the way to the panoramic shot of the city, looking down on rooftops, and sets the panel's particular details. It even gives us Moore's intention to get out there and make trouble, although how Watchmen is going to make trouble perhaps needs some interpretation. Dave Gibbons drew the page faithfully to Moore's script, and here's his Bristol board inked page. Gibbons, also English, was born in 1949 and began in the British underground scene and afterwards worked for DC and IPC. Gibbons contributed artwork to the first issue of 2000 AD in the mid-1970s. It is interesting to look at his inked pencils and note what is gained and what is lost. Moore specifically requests rooftops and talks about a curiously altered cityscape, neither of which are entirely in Gibbons' inked first page. What does come out from the perspective of this single element, to my mind at least, is a sense of structured organization, of an order that prevails even as Rorschach announces foaming chaos. The page is tightly gridded, and in black and white the sidewalk, the building windows, and the avenues all conspire to insist on the ordered nature of reality, in a way that isn't really in Moore's script. The page truly takes on its identity when it is colored by John Higgins. Higgins, the same age as Gibbons, is a colorist, artist, and writer. He also worked on 2000 AD in the late 70s. Here's the color guide, showing the colored first page and the color codes written in the margins by hand. It is in this phase of the production that the page suddenly takes on its reality. The latent order of the grid fades into the background, muted by the color scheme, and Rorschach seems entirely correct in his assessment that the streets are extended gutters and the gutters are full of blood. The color confirms Moore's vision for the page. Moore's script announced that he is drenched in blood up to his elbows, and now so is the page, although it took the full production cycle of the comic to realize his vision. Watchmen is a superhero story about perspective in the broadest sense. It asks who watches the Watchmen, and each of its characters will provide a different answer, a different perspective, both on the mystery that it begins with and on the larger question of a proper perspective on life. Some, down in the blood-soaked streets, believing in a day's work for a day's pay. Another, standing far above those streets, far above the planet, in fact, and taking it all in, but perhaps missing some simple truths. But the most inclusive answer to the question of who watches the Watchmen is already before us. We do. We read the comic, and this allows us tremendous perspective on its contents, and by extension, on our own lives. I will make this case in 3 following lectures. In my first, I will consider the poetics of Watchmen, how it merges comic book history with comic book layout. In my second, I distinguish between kinds of media, film and comic, to study Moore's approach to the book. In my last, I suggest that the arts that travel by physical books bear a particular relationship to time, and so I suggest a new term, graphia, to sum up this relationship. Throughout, I argue that art gives us perspective on the world and on the media in which we live, individual forms of media certainly, but more broadly, time and materiality itself. All art forms give us an open text. We bring to it our perspective, asking it questions from different angles and interpreting its answers accordingly. And so, we empower it and we empower ourselves. The reading of comics, the study of art, creates a cycle of meaning that allows us new perspective on the world.